please drop any questions you have into the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. We'll be monitoring those questions and getting to them as time permits at the end of the session today. Also, we greatly appreciate the time that many of you took to submit questions ahead of time. So thank you very much. All right. Before we get too much further into the agenda, I definitely want to do a land acknowledgement. We meet today on a virtual platform, and we would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. So today we would like to acknowledge that the land on which Rubicon is housed is the traditional territory and treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we are grateful to be here. Next on our agenda after me is Karen Murray, and she'll introduce us to culturally relevant pedagogy. We'll then hear from many of the My Best Idea contributors with the highlights from their chapters. And then we'll come back together to say thanks and answer any questions. Please also note that we'll have a draw, and one person here today will win a copy of the book, My Best Idea, Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. We'll notify the winner by email. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Karen Murray. Karen Murray is the Systems Superintendent for Equity, Anti-Racism, and Anti-Oppression for the first Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement in the Toronto District School Board, and one of the editors for MBI CRP. Over to you, Karen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I'm going to get started because I want to be able to ensure our writers get an opportunity to highlight their sections and how the work that we did, which is a project of joy, is able to make a difference, not only for students, but for educators across this province. So let's go to the next. So what is culturally relevant pedagogy? Well, this is derived from the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. And this started when she was engaged in some research in 1995, looking at schools that were overachieving and were actually enhancing the learning and the experiences for racialized and historically marginalized students. Specifically, it was enhancing the experiences for Black students. And what you found in these schools was that all the educators were engaging in some specific work. And these three tenets that I'm going to share are the works in which she found. One, every one of them had high expectations. And this is where they were centering joy. They were centering students, and they were honoring their identities. And they had high expectations for them, not only academically, but also in the ways in which they engaged and in the classrooms and schools. The other thing she found was that everyone was engaging with cultural competence. And with this, it was that important piece of honoring the lived experiences, the identities of students, their families, and communities, and centering that within the work that they were doing in terms of classroom, curriculum, and experiences within school. And the third tenet she spoke to was around critical consciousness. And this not only came from her work, but also the work of Paulo Freire. And it talked about students engaging in becoming critical and active agents of their own learning. These three tenets make up the pedagogy and the foundation and the framework of what we have engaged in My Big Idea. This resource brings CRP to life because it shows that culturally relevant pedagogy is an actionable theory that brings us closer to creating those spaces that are equitable and inclusive for all. So can we go to the next slide? So what do we know? We know that in order to engage in this work, then us as educators need to lead through a culturally relevant stance. Because it's for too long, Black and Indigenous and racialized students have sat in classrooms where they did not feel affirmed, they did not feel a sense of belonging, and did not see themselves reflected in the school environment. And one of the things we wrote about is we wanted you to imagine an educational system where the focus is on juror, on where Black and Indigenous and racialized students can demonstrate their brilliance every single day. And where all students can not only learn about themselves, but also affirm their intersecting identities as they learn about one another. This is what culturally relevant teaching can achieve. And this is the aim of the resource we're sharing with you. Can I go to the next one? So one of the things we did is we set up some key ideas to think about when you think about engaging in culturally relevant pedagogy. And with this, it helps us to think about what it can look and sound and feel like in our own practice. So I'm not going to share all, but we did identify 10, and I'm going to take a few minutes just to bring forward a few. So one of the things we talked about is that when we think about culturally relevant pedagogy, we want to foster intellectual curiosity, which means we bring anti-oppression learning into the spaces as we honor those multiple perspectives and ways and knowledge and experiences of students. We center student voice, and we do so to co-create those learning opportunities so that students can engage in self-efficacy for themselves. We commit to an assets-based approach. So when you're asking, what does our culturally relevant pedagogy looks like? It looks like us affirming students. We engage in partnership. We engage in partnership with not only families, but also community, so that we can include them in our co-planning and with the curriculum in which we engage with students. We also challenge assumptions and disrupt individual and structural discrimination of all kinds. We can't stand on a foundation where we believe in high expectations and we honor cultural competence without dismantling discriminatory actions, hate, and racism as they occur. We also recognize, respect, and understand differences and the complexities within. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what have we done? In this resource, we've highlighted some classroom tested experiences, ideas, which includes, and when you see the resources and you get an opportunity, and to be honest, it's the most beautiful thing. I'm gonna say that right now. You get an overview of the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, which includes what I shared. There's an actionable bottom line in every single one of the sections, which tells you what you can implement today, your next move. And we've included also easily to understand diagrams and key concepts around classroom and practice. One of the things we want to always think about as we engage in this work is that when we look at what critical consciousness look like, what it does is sets up the conditions for students to be able to navigate and negotiate the world around them. But it also sets us up as educators in ways in which we can build our own critical consciousness, so we can build a critical consciousness of our students. And so with that being said, I'm looking forward to our team as they highlight their various components of this resource. So I'm now sending it to Stella and to Jason.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Karen. Hi, everyone. My name is Stella Kim. The best idea that I write about is informed by my experience as a science teacher and as an educational consultant working with teachers.
And hi, everyone. I'm Jason Toe. I'm a high school math teacher, consultant, district lead, and the best idea that it's actually like 3 little best ideas that I have, but the ones that I share about affirming identities through mathematics and making learning socially relevant to students.
In our chapter, we talk about how teaching in culturally relevant and responsive ways requires preparation. That's where our chapter starts. It's really tough to know how to teach science and math in culturally relevant and responsive ways because STEM has a reputation of being neutral and objective, a place where identity doesn't matter. It's like a meritocracy, has that reputation of being populated by natural talent. And in response to that, in our chapter, we really emphasize the importance of educator reflection and our ongoing learning about the world. We talk about teaching lessons that connect science and math to students' dynamic identities and to an evolving world. That educator reflection really begins by looking inward to thinking about how our multiple identities emerged and evolved. And that includes thinking about how you came to see yourself as a student, as a science and math learner, how you came to understand yourself as a member of cultural, racial, socioeconomic, and other groups. So with a heightened awareness of our own autobiographies, then educators are positioned to think about the biographies of others. Regardless of the histories of our communities, our economic station, our real perceived identities, the sociopolitical realities that surround them, inequalities, they're important influences in our lives. And that reflection helps us to think about that. And then this becomes really clear when we begin to think about experiences beyond our own, inside and outside of schools. So this really seeds the ground for thinking about how we cultivate our critical consciousness, the critical consciousness that's necessary for CRP teaching, and it really requires our upkeep. It's best supported also through an active ongoing engagement in a diverse critical community in our schools. One of the best things that I ever did was, in addition to that background reflection, is to think with students about identity in the context of fields of STEM. For years and years, researchers in the US have observed that people who are Indigenous, Black, disabled, 2S LGBTQ+, women, and other groups are underrepresented here. And for me in my practice, it was important to talk to students about identity in the context of that in STEM classes. And that set the stage for the importance of learning science in ways that are contextual, based in real world issues that involve science and other disciplines and other ways of thinking and knowing.
Thanks, Stella. And I'd like to build upon some of your points about developing identities, because for many students, particularly older ones, mathematics becomes more and more dissociated from people's identities. Think of people that say, I'm not a math person. And that really happens for a myriad of reasons. But a core issue is that the mathematics that's being taught in schools is not always reflective of students' interests or values or what they deem important to them. And so in my section, I share a vignette of learning about a student who was rather disinterested in math class, and then tapping into a core aspect of their identity and leveraged it not only to build interest and engagement, but really to also affirm that who he was as a Black male had cultural roots that are mathematically deep, which I knew resonated with him. And so we need to create opportunities for students to understand that every single one of them is a product of a mathematically rich culture, history, and ancestry. Every single one of them and every single one of us is a math person because we all come from math people before us. However, there are norms that exist within the culture of mathematics classes that unfortunately create barriers both historically and currently for students to thrive, particularly Indigenous and Black students. I think of academic streaming. I think of behavioral expectations, certain forms of mathematical expression that are preferred over others. These are things that we have to really interrogate and identify before we're able to see a collective flourishing of all students. And another important point that I share is, an important way to make math culturally relevant is using mathematics to go deeper into learning about issues of social justice that matter to students, that they're living through and directly impact their lives. I think that by showing how powerful of an instrument mathematics can be to shed light on issues of discrimination, environmental justice, and health, the answer to the most popular question in math class, which is why do we have to learn this, becomes rather self-evident. And so that's just a few ideas to make mathematics more relevant, culturally relevant for the benefit of all students. Now I'd like to pass it along to our colleague, Colette Murray. Colette?
Thank you so much, Stella and Jason. I entered this conversation as a professional artist and a dance educator that also is an artistic director of a collective. So I bring a community arts practice into the classroom. Next slide, please. So I have lived experience as a student in the Ontario Ministry of Education public school system, from kindergarten all the way up. So I also intersect this experience with my research on addressing Black student success, but also interrogating my own personal pedagogy as a dance educator. So when I enter into the school, I am a community member that's entering to the school culture. So I have to be aware of how I'm arriving into the space. But I also intersect my professional arts practice with my social justice, equity, education, and dance degrees to enter this conversation because my collective uses a culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. Next slide. So in the chapter that I wrote, I'm basically arriving as an artist that is already aware of the literature review and the research and the achievement gaps for Black and racialized students. So as an artist arriving, it was really important that I'm trying to reiterate in this chapter that artists also need to arrive with an understanding about the localized data that's in the school and the classroom, because we're not there on a day-to-day. And it's important that we have a conversation with the educational leadership to get a sense of what's going on as we arrive. So in my chapter, I'm speaking about an intentional methodology where I'm asking and having discussions with the educational leadership who is rooted in culturally relevant pedagogy, and how we found out through focus group discussions with the students, because I needed to know the demographic, I needed to know what were the needs of the students and what identities was I going to center. And with this methodology, create this collaborative co-design of an artistic model. So my role was to create the artistic application. And what I used was cultural arts, which I define as an integration of Afro-diasporic arts practices that have social significance, that have intergenerational values, and they're the contextualized history in the current contemporary realities is going to give credit to the communities, ethnic communities of origin. So in my example, the school that I work with, the students were engaged in workshops as well as the educators that was designed by the educational leadership to engage in equity and diversity concepts. anti-Black racism, anti-racism, and anti-oppression. And the students, after voicing their concerns and their needs, which pretty much was they needed to learn about, they actually felt an unbelonging in the school. They wanted to learn about their culture in their school experience. So I had to bring in the cultural arts in order to create an artistic experience to bring that knowledge into the classroom. Next slide, please. So in this chapter, next slide. Next slide again. Yes. So the result was workshops that led into an artistic applications where the students' voice, they chose which artistic medium they wanted to engage in. And through the interrogation of these anti-racism, anti-oppression concepts, they were exploring their own self-expression and student identity and developing abilities and developing their voice by engaging in the cultural arts, whether it was spoken word, it was dance, visual arts, and percussion, which is what my collective had brought in. And basically they were enhancing their experience. They felt affirmed because they were shifting from a Eurocentric focus, and they wanted to see that their lived histories and their current realities was being represented culturally through the arts. And in this chapter, one of the highlights I make is about creating this relationship between the artists and the school system. Teachers and the education leadership should have a collaborative relationship with skilled cultural arts educators who are aligned, and they see and see that artists are knowledge holders that can come into the classroom and be assets to enhance the student experience. And I'm going to pass it on over to my colleague, Cindy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks everyone for being here. So my chapter is on the 5 faces of oppression. And if I guess we go to the next slide, there they are. So just let me back up a little bit and bring you to how I come to these 5 faces of oppression, what they have to do with my lesson. So for me, as a teacher, I sort of believe in the model of teacher as activist, and the idea that teachers can come into classrooms and can create more justice-oriented societies through the work we do in schools, helping students become change agents in their own lives and in their own, the society that they will that they're in now and that they will inherit to be the leaders in tomorrow. And so one of the things I love about teaching middle school is that students tend to be very, very justice oriented. They want world peace. They want to stop all forms of discrimination. They seem very committed to an anti-oppressive framework. And yet, despite this, you only need to spend a little time in the lunchroom to hear that sometimes students don't always conduct themselves in the most anti-oppressive ways. And that became a really interesting problem for me to solve when I was a new teacher. So as a teacher who wanted to teach about critical thinking and make sure critical thinking and critical analysis was always at the center point of my media literacy and language arts programs, and also wanting to make sure anti-oppression was a major course of our study, something that we were always thinking about in the classroom. And then, of course, wanting to make sure that it all comes together so that students become themselves responsible and capable critical thinkers. The question was, how do I bring this all together, and what vehicle might help that to happen? And the answer was this lesson. So I read in a book years ago about the concept of the 5 faces of oppression, and that all oppression, every time someone's mistreated, every time somebody is hurt or harmed, it takes one of these 5 faces. Sometimes the harm is more than one of the faces, but always falls into one of these 5. And those are exploitation, basically trying to profit off someone's work and for your own gain; marginalization, when people are relegated to the margins of society and pushed out; powerlessness, the sense that you don't have any power or sense of ability to change things; cultural imperialism, the idea that one culture is right or valid or valued and other cultures are wrong or problems or undervalued; and of course violence, physical or other types of harm that is done through harsh action. And so those 5 faces of oppression, they're come out of the work of a researcher named Iris Young. So I hadn't come up with this concept, I'm just taking it. And the lesson that I've included in the book is one wherein this concept, is taught to students so that they can understand the 5 faces of oppression. They come to make very, very clear sense of it, and then have the ability to analyze media texts and look for examples of exploitation, look for examples of marginalization, etc. And what I found to be really wonderful about doing this particular lesson is that, well, 2 things. One is that students, as I said before, I believe truly often have the desire to be anti-oppressive and to seek equity in their, worlds, but sometimes they're not aware of the water in which they swim in and the way in which the things that they have just been, socialized in the cultural world around them actually reinforce some of that very injustice they want to fight, some of that oppression that they want to stand up against. And so this allows students to be able to take a step back and actually critically view the world in ways that they can not only pick out examples of oppression, but in doing so, start to notice them more and therefore grow their own critical consciousness. Where this lesson, and that's one part of it, but the other part of it is that in classrooms, I had the experience of trying to, disrupt oppression and talk about equity issues from our own experiences. And while that's wonderful, it can sometimes be very painful and it can be very, very difficult. For example, if you want to talk about how an incident that happened between 2 students was very exploitive or very, marginalizing, it can be difficult for those students to hear it because it's personal and it's about them, and it's hard to get over that hurt and that feeling that you're being called out or put down. And so this lesson creates a really great way of being able to say, watch an episode of that TV show that's most common in your classroom. I've done this lesson with The Simpsons, King of the Hill, The Big Bang Theory. I could go on. You name a common comedy show and it will work. I mean, even not a comedy. And the idea being is that now students are calling out examples of marginalization, powerlessness, exploitation that aren't personal to their lives, and they're not calling out one another. And so then what inevitably, in my experience, happens is that students start to be able to detect those types of oppression and those 5 faces of oppression, and then they start adjusting their behavior and what they see in the world and becoming more, I'll say, just citizens with a critical consciousness. And that was my 5-minute timer. I think I'm done anyhow. So thank you very much. And I'll pass it on to Alice.
Thanks, Cindy. As a very brief intro, good afternoon, everyone. I'm an educator of 30 years and also a union and social justice activist of longer than 30 years. That's my intro. David, can you go to the next slide? So I'm going to spend my 5 minutes talking about the chapter. The chapter is called Constructing Knowledge, Finding Voice, and Making Critical Connections Through Culturally Relevant Approaches. Bit of a mouthful. To give you a bit of context on this chapter and how it came to be is, this was a learning event about 7 years ago that spanned 8 weeks. It took place in a grade 5-6 classroom of a culturally and linguistically diverse K-6 school, about 70 languages represented in the families and communities, and a very working class neighborhood of Toronto. The classroom teacher is named Jessica Vink, also a co-author of this chapter. And at the time, I was in the role of a student work study teacher as part of a literacy and numeracy secretariat collaborative study program. So in this chapter, we share 2 learning events that focus specifically on students as theory makers and knowledge constructors. So the question that Jessica and I were exploring as teachers was, what are the classroom conditions in order for students to make deep connections with their learning, to learn about themselves and understand the world around them better? So Jessica and I came into this event with some mindsets and assumptions that correlate with culturally relevant approaches, as Karen explained earlier. Number 1, that teaching and learning begins, moves, and ends with and through the students' lived experiences and understandings, that they need to be agents of their learning and knowledge. Number 2, that as educators, we facilitate and guide in the students' learning and knowledge construction. We are not sages. And number 3, that as educators, our identities and limited knowledge also matter, that we need to understand what we know and what we don't know. So the unit began with an exploration of Indigenous communities, both past and present. So both Jessica and I are settlers, and we do not have Indigenous ancestry. And as far as we knew, neither did any of the students in the classroom. Jessica and I intentionally then sought resources from Indigenous Education Department of the Toronto District School Board, as well as using Rethinking Schools resources, an educational site that I've often found very useful. We also invited Indigenous community members into the classroom in partnership, read books and articles written by Indigenous authors and scholars for ourselves and with the students. Next slide, please. So we came to this space of learning with openness as well as limitations. And this is important because such curiosities demand a certain amount of openness, risk-taking, and trust in the process with ourselves and with the students. The learning we entered into cannot happen without this classroom space having already fostered and established a safe learning community. In other words, we didn't venture into this in September. Initially in the unit, students came with their assumptions and stereotypes and limited understandings of Indigenous communities, past and present. They held little firsthand experience with this community. They needed to know that their initial thinking was not going to be judged, that it is a place for us to start, and room for messiness is a very important part of knowledge construction. The critical conversations that came next was through the intentionally selected resources in the form of storybooks, multimedia sources such as videos and blogs, as well as classroom visitors. With the class, we learned about residential schools, the 60s scoop, intergenerational trauma, current Indigenous leaders, as well as issues of truth and reconciliation. This exploration is the collective knowledge construction that resulted. Students' thinking shifted, values shifted, understanding shifted through a process of conversation, reading, questioning, and reflection. Next transition. Thank you. We move the focus of learning to the concept of identity, specifically the students' identities, their communities, their own lived experiences. And again, we selected resources that deepen their exploration of identity through novel studies, articles, multimedia sources, with the goal of developing personal and collective learnings. Through this process, what resulted was a much more profound understanding of self and others. So I'd like to culminate my piece just to read a couple of students' quotes through this question that we used as a final query in the class. The question is, what, if anything, have you learned about yourself, your classmates, and or the world in this unit? One student said, I've always seen it through my perspective, making assumptions on other people, and never through somebody else's eyes. When we talk about residential schools, I learned about Indigenous people's experiences through their eyes, which helped me understand things better from their perspective. Another quote, which I found was very encapsulating in the work and the growth of this class. It also cements the idea that any deep learning results in self-love and self-understanding and a more profound understanding of those around us. And I quote, I felt as if my comfort level went beyond its limit, and I feel like I love myself more. I felt I took off my superhero mask and became a cooler version of myself. I think my classmates did the same. Every time I read that quote, I just feel like all sucky inside. The student's statement intersects the gamut of human experiences of loving oneself, growing as an individual and with others, and finding our place in a complex world. Last transition, David. Great. So the 3 takeaways I leave with you in culturally relevant practice that you'll find in this article is to dedicate time for students to work through and find value in their thinking and the thinking of their peers. This chapter will give you some suggestions on the questions to explore and strategies such as the iceberg activity with your classroom. Second is implement an interdisciplinary approach, connect to students' lives as well as different components of subjects in your curriculum. The chapter also offers suggestions on ways to incorporate the digital world and technology into explorations of identity. And finally, offer students experiences through diverse perspectives, counter and alternative narratives to deepen their understandings of the world. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Jennifer Watt.
Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This afternoon, I'm really excited to speak about my best idea in culturally relevant pedagogy that I actually share with my colleague, Ken Scott, who is a former grade 6 teacher. You can go to the next slide, please. So Ken and I share a passion for social studies. I mean, who doesn't love the stories of the earth, the people, the ideas, the cultures, the highs and the lows of human history? So Ken and I are also total enthusiasts of inquiry learning, and we're always eager to share that inquiry learning at its very best requires a culturally relevant approach. Inquiry should always begin and be fueled by student questions. The inquiry cycle, as pictured here, places high expectations on students as questioners and investigators of what they're excited about and what they are determined to learn. Getting kids to be curious and ask questions is the key, and this does require practice. So in the chapter, we share how students describe how they can create and revise powerful questions that help them to become social studies learners. We also detail how the students in Ken's grade 6 class pose questions such as, what was it like for a child to live in New France? Why did the early Chinese Canadians move to Canada? And who were the Jamaican Maroons, and how did their culture thrive? Their sense of self-efficacy was strengthened as they moved through some highly complex skills to arrive at possible answers to questions that they actually care about. We know that students enjoy these critical discussions of power, privilege, and justice. They like to dig below the surface narratives and go beyond dominant narratives and to create new histories based on the experiences, knowledge, and artifacts, and communities. The teacher's role is to assist and encourage students, since the inquiry process can be messy and frustrating at times. However, if a teacher models how to question, how to gather, and how to interrogate sources, and how to arise to thoughtful new understandings, what better way is there to build student skills across academic disciplines and the skills required for students to advocate for themselves and their communities? Next slide, please. The teacher's job is to take a CRP stance themselves when implementing the social studies curriculum that we get from the ministry by developing a core set of inquiry questions that have no easy answer and demand complex thought from multiple perspectives. See how these sample guided questions invite kids to take a critical stance. And some of these questions may even help to build their critical consciousness. In our chapter, we share students' responses to what they actually found challenging in inquiry learning in social studies, in addition to what motivated them. So I want to sum up by sharing a quote from a student as well, that I feel is indicative of someone who firmly believes that their lived experiences are worthy of further investigation. This student said, "My topic in social studies is the Jamaican Maroons. I picked it because my dad and his side of the family are Jamaican." So this is the essence of culturally relevant pedagogy and inquiry learning to me. So now it is time actually to take some questions, and I will ask Karen Murray to moderate the Q&A and to begin by answering some selected questions that you sent us when you registered for the webinar. And hopefully we'll have some time to address other ones as well. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks so much, the entire team. That was absolutely brilliant and amazing learning and amazing conversation. And I hope we have set it up where people can extend what they heard from all of us today through the resource in which we are so very, very proud of. So what I wanted to position, there were a few questions that came in. And one of them talked about, so when I'm engaging in culturally relevant pedagogy, how do I change the mindsets of others? How do I work with those who are resistant to the idea that this framework and this theory is something that they should be engaging in? And I think the best way to answer that is to say, if you listen to the presentations that we all engaged in over the last 45 minutes, it's not about changing mindsets. It's about the work that we are to do if we want to honor students within our classrooms and schools. We know that in many cases, there are young students and families and communities that do not see themselves reflected in our curriculum. And it takes us as leaders, educational leaders, to find those spaces in the curriculum to make it happen. So you heard from Stella and Jason as they talk about what it could be in science and math. You heard from Alice and Jennifer, who not only entered student voice in a specific way, but they also talked about what it can look like as we engage in literacy. We had Cindy, who positioned that when we put students as leaders and to become agents and advocates of their own learning, how they can then help build curriculum for themselves, not only through us. And then you heard Colette as she talked about how we build that bridge, the cultural competence with community, and how community educators extend learning and how they can do so through the various mediums of the arts, which allows students to have voice in a way that is different than just what they write on paper. So I think that is the best answer I can give on how do you change mindset. You change mindset that by positioning students, so those who are often left out can see a mirror of themselves inside of the work that we do. And those who are learning can be part of that window of seeing the difference in others. So I think we can move to maybe answering one or two that may come into the Q&A. Who's going to position that? Is it you, David?
Sure, Karen, I can find a question or two from the Q&A for us to answer. Navjot has a question that's for Jason. Wondering, what are your thoughts about the use of the term academic throughout the learning in grade 10 math with the goal of producing perfect, in quotes, responses? Obviously, it's not aligned with the CRP mindset, but is it happening currently? So how could this be addressed?
You know, the term academic is just it's a label, really, right? It's a bit of a relic, you know, when we think a little bit about how learning, I guess, is now positioned through a culturally relevant and responsive, and also an inclusive, like a more inclusive minded school system. So, I mean, I hope that as courses become revised by the ministry, that that those kinds of labels begin to kind of become obsolete. And that whole piece around creating perfect answers, I hope that that's not the final goal of any math teacher. I think Jennifer put it very eloquently about inquiry learning and centering students as part of that, and that's not something that just happens in social studies or language or those that vein of classes, but needs to happen also in mathematics. Students need to know that it's an opportunity for them to play around with ideas and to try to find joy and beauty in the math. It's not just about achieving some sort of objective. School is about learning. It's not a performance. So I think that kind of shifting of our goals as teachers, I think that takes a lot of that's going to take a lot of time. But I see a lot of incredible teachers and teacher leaders across our province, and and everywhere really, that are slowly trying to make that shift.
Thank you, Jason. Karen, we have one more question that's an anonymous one, and it asks, and it's about definitions. It asks, to what degree is culturally relevant pedagogy similar or different from culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy?
Oh, well, great question, Anonymous. So I'm going to take us in a little context. So culturally relevant pedagogy, as I just shared, situates within the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. Culturally responsive pedagogy situates within the work of Geneva Gay. And what happened actually in around 2009, both bodies of work was brought to OISE, University of Toronto. I was there at the time, along with my colleague and good friend, Dr. Nicole West Burns, as well as Dr. Lance McCready and others, Jeff Kugler, etc. And we were trying to figure out how within the Canadian context can we utilize both bodies of work, because there's similarities, but there are actually differences. So what happened was both bodies of work were brought together. So many times you hear people talk about CRRP, which is the relevant and responsive being brought together. Now, with the CRRP, what they decided and what we decided to do was that the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, the 3 tenets that we're talking about today, landed as the basis of the foundations of that work, with some of the other key elements from responsive pedagogy intertwined. So are they similar? Absolutely. But no, in terms of history, relevant and responsive has 2 different theorists and that moves that work. But in the Canadian context, both was brought together. And also the tenets from Gloria Ladson-Billings, those 3 we talk about, high expectations, cultural competence, and critical consciousness, was layered as the basis for CRRP. I hope that helps, Anonymous, and it was a good question.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think that's all the questions.
we had one more that we had positioned, but we thought we would see what was in the chat and then go back. So some people sent forward with some questions prior, and I think maybe we could take a chance to answer one of these, and then I think I want to just position, if we have any leaders in the space, the importance of leadership in this work. So one of the things people talked about is, what does this look like interdisciplinary? And as we engage in in our school improvement process. So as you design the work around being culturally relevant and in terms of curriculum and long-range planning, you have to think about what are those resources that you're going to utilize. And this is human and or ones in which we engage in terms of the types of books, the types of media resources, all these things that you're bringing, not only for students, but also for staff. One of the things we know, you can't build, as we said, the critical consciousness of your students if you can't build it within yourself. So you need to think about what resources that I'm using to enhance the curriculum as I engage in this work, but also what work and resources am I using to build the capacity of our teams and our staff. The last thing I'll say about this as I move into why it's important to be part of your school improvement planning. As educational leaders, we hold such a responsibility in building the conditions in our schools for this to happen. And without doing so, it's difficult for educators to be able to feel confident to engage in work that we know is making a difference in the lives of children. So educators need us, the leaders, to set those conditions in everything we do, the decisions we make, what we bring into our schools as supports, so that this work can live and bear and breathe. I think we might have one more question. Or no?
I think that's it, Karen. Oh, sorry. We have we do have a thanks in the Q&A from Nigel, who says, "This is amazing. Thank you for this great book and resource."
Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna then, if no one else has one more thing to say, I'll send it back over to you, David, and the team. And thank you so much, Rubicon, and thanks again, team, for your best idea and your best ways of sharing our good work.
Thank you very much, Karen. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to all of the presenters today for your thoughtful, eye-opening, engaging presentations. I know that I learned a lot. I know that I will be picking up my copy of MBI CRP and digging into your chapters this evening. If anyone who took the time to join us today, I want to thank you very much for doing that. If you feel the same and would like to pick up a copy, there's a QR code on the screen now that will get you to the page where you can order a copy or two or more. If you use the code that's on the screen now, you'll get 10% off your order. We'll also follow up with everyone who registered, whether they can make it tonight or not, with a link to the recording of today's session and also a link to where you can find the book. So thank you everyone so much. Hope everyone has a great week.